I locked 85 kids out of a neighborhood playground, and for about 48 hours, half the people in my community thought I was the coldest man they'd ever met. The funny part is, if you'd driven by that Monday morning, watched all those parents standing outside a locked chain-link fence while kids cried because they couldn't get to the swings, you probably would have agreed with them. But what nobody wanted to ask was a much simpler question. How does someone build an entire playground on another person's land without ever asking? My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 36 years old. I work as a cybersecurity consultant. And until this whole mess happened, I was the kind of neighbor people barely noticed. I lived just outside Franklin, Tennessee, on a quiet corner lot I'd bought several years earlier because I thought someday I'd build a house there after my consulting career slowed down. The property wasn't huge, just over 2,000 square feet of open grass beside the subdivision. But it sat in one of those places where developers always assume every empty piece of land belongs to somebody else, or worse, belongs to nobody. Back in late 2023, my company sent me overseas to help secure the computer systems of a manufacturing client. One project turned into another, then another. And before I realized it, I'd spent almost 10 months bouncing between Germany, Poland, and Singapore. During that time, my lot just sat there exactly the way I'd left it, freshly mowed by a local landscaping company I'd hired to keep it from looking abandoned. Every month I'd pay the invoice, glance at the satellite image online once in a while, and think, one day I'll figure out what to build there. I had no reason to think anyone else was making plans for it. Then I came home. Jet lag has a strange way of making everything feel slightly unreal, and that's exactly how I felt driving through the subdivision that first Saturday afternoon. At first I thought my GPS had glitched because where my empty fields should have been, there were bright blue slides, 2 swing sets, colorful climbing structures, a splash pad spraying water into the air, picnic tables packed with families, balloons tied to the entrance, and kids laughing everywhere. For a second, I honestly smiled because I figured the county must have built a public park somewhere nearby. Then I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The old oak tree near the back corner. My oak tree was standing right beside the playground entrance. I pulled over so fast my coffee spilled across the passenger seat. I got out and walked toward the fence, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe the property lines weren't where I remembered. Maybe I'd forgotten something from closing paperwork years ago. Maybe I was just exhausted after traveling halfway around the world. A little girl ran past me carrying a melting popsicle while her father nodded politely. "Beautiful park, isn't it?" he said with a grin. I forced a smile. "Yeah, it's definitely something." I walked back to my truck, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out the worn folder where I'd kept every document from buying that land. Survey, title policy, plat map. They traveled with me through 3 apartments because my dad always drilled one lesson into me growing up. Never throw away paperwork involving land. I spread everything across the hood of my truck and started comparing landmarks. There wasn't even a little ambiguity. The splash pad sat almost dead center on my property. The swings crossed directly over the western boundary. The picnic pavilion was planted nearly 30 feet inside my lot. Every single permanent structure belonged on paper to me. I remember just standing there listening to children laugh while my brain tried to process how something so ridiculous could actually happen. Anger wasn't even the first emotion. Confusion was, because mistakes happen. Surveyors misread maps. Contractors dig in the wrong place. People apologize, fix the problem, and move on. At least that's what I believed that afternoon. So instead of making a scene, I started asking questions. An older man sitting at one of the picnic tables introduced himself as Carl. He'd lived in the neighborhood almost 15 years. When I casually asked who paid for the playground, his face lit up. "Our HOA president," he said proudly, "Melissa Harding. She made this her mission. Organized fundraisers, got everyone excited, even raised the annual dues a little. Cost over $100 grand. But she said every kid deserved a safe place to play." I nodded slowly. "Did anybody ever mention who owned this land?" Carl laughed like I'd asked the dumbest question in America. "It's HOA property, isn't it?" I didn't answer. Instead, I thanked him, got back into my truck, and drove straight to the county records office first thing Monday morning. I wanted one person with an official title to tell me I was wrong. Instead, the clerk looked at my parcel number, pulled up the digital survey, rotated her monitor toward me, and quietly said, "Mr. Brooks, unless something changed that hasn't been recorded yet, This entire playground appears to be sitting on your property. That was the moment everything changed. The problem wasn't that somebody had made a simple mistake. The problem was that somebody had spent months raising money, approving construction, pouring concrete, installing equipment, and celebrating ribbon-cutting ceremonies without bothering to verify who actually owned the ground beneath their feet. And before I spoke to a single lawyer or confronted anyone from the HOA, I decided to give them every opportunity to admit the mistake themselves. After all, I still believed reasonable people solved problems with conversations. I just had no idea that the first conversation with Melissa Harding was about to teach me exactly how dangerous a little unchecked authority could become. Melissa Harding turned out to be exactly the kind of person who could make you question your own memory without ever raising her voice. Her office sat inside the HOA clubhouse, a building decorated with framed photos of neighborhood barbecues, Christmas parades, and smiling families. The sort of place designed to make authority feel friendly. She greeted me with a practiced smile before I even introduced myself. "You must be Ethan," she said, extending her hand. "I hear you're finally back home. Welcome." That caught me off guard. "You knew I owned the lot?" Her smile barely moved. "Of course. We keep track of the neighborhood." I slid my survey across her desk. "Then you also know the playground is sitting on my property." She didn't even look down. She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and sighed like a teacher preparing to explain something obvious to a stubborn student. "Ethan, that field has been unused for years. Everyone assumed." "I'm not asking what everyone assumed," I interrupted quietly. "I'm asking why no one asked." For the first time, her expression hardened, because the community needed the space. There it was, not an apology, not surprise, just justification. I pushed a plat map beside the survey. "The county confirmed the boundaries this morning." She finally glanced at the papers for maybe 2 seconds before pushing them back toward me. "Those old surveys are often inaccurate. This one was recorded with the county. Then perhaps the county made a mistake." I couldn't help laughing, not because it was funny, but because I realized she had already decided reality was negotiable. I stood up, gathered my documents, and said, "Melissa, I am giving you the chance to fix this before lawyers get involved." She smiled again, except this time it looked more like a warning than kindness. "Do what you think you need to do." Walking back to my truck, I kept replaying that conversation in my head. I wanted to believe she was bluffing, that she'd call later after checking the records. Maybe embarrassed, maybe ready to work something out. Instead, nothing happened. I sent a detailed email that afternoon with copies of the survey, county parcel maps, and photos comparing the recorded boundary markers to the actual playground. No reply. 3 days later, I sent another, this time attaching the original closing documents from when I bought the property. Silence. A week later, I emailed again, politely explaining that I wasn't interested in taking away the playground if we could find a legal solution. Still nothing. My neighbor Carl stopped me one evening while I was checking the corner markers. "Melissa says you're trying to force the HOA into buying land that was donated years ago." I blinked. "Donated? I never donated anything." Carl frowned. "That's not what everyone heard." It was my first glimpse of how quickly rumors travel when they're useful. Within another week, people I'd never met were giving me strange looks at the grocery store. One woman actually muttered, "Some people only care about money." She had no idea who I was, but she'd already decided the story. That's when I contacted my title insurance company. I'd almost forgotten the policy even existed until my father reminded me during a phone call. He listened quietly while I explained everything, then asked one simple question. "Did anyone build permanent structures? Concrete foundations? Call the title company tomorrow." 2 days later, an adjuster named Rebecca met me on site. She walked the property with a GPS unit, photographed every structure, measured distances, and took more notes than I'd ever seen anyone write. Before leaving, she looked directly at me and said, "Ethan, I'm going to be honest. This isn't just trespassing. This creates liability. If a child gets seriously hurt on equipment located on your land, you're almost certainly going to be pulled into any lawsuit." That sentence landed harder than everything else combined. I hadn't been thinking about lawsuits. I'd been thinking about fairness. Suddenly, the issue wasn't simply ownership. It was responsibility. Every scraped knee, every broken arm, every accident involving that splash pad could eventually have my name attached to it. Rebecca's report arrived 4 days later. It concluded that the structures had been built without permission, without an easement, and without any recorded agreement with the property owner. She recommended immediate legal action to reduce liability exposure. My attorney, David Mercer, read the report twice before speaking. You have every legal right to demand removal. I don't want them to tear down a playground full of happy kids. Then what do you want? I stared out his office window for several seconds before answering. I want adults to start acting like adults. David smiled slightly. Then let's give them the opportunity. We drafted a formal certified letter addressed to the HOA board, not just Melissa. It explained the ownership issue, enclosed every supporting document, and gave them 11 calendar days to contact us regarding a resolution. It specifically stated that continued public use after the deadline would force me to secure the property for insurance reasons. Every board member signed for the letter. We tracked every delivery confirmation. Day 1 passed. Nothing. Day 4. Nothing. Day 7. Still silence. On day 9, my phone finally rang. Melissa, you're really doing this? She asked without saying hello. Doing what? Threatening children. No. Melissa, I'm notifying adults. The community isn't afraid of empty threats. Good, I replied calmly. Then this conversation is finished. She hung up before I could say another word. Saturday morning arrived warm and clear. At 7 o'clock sharp, a fencing contractor pulled into the lot with 3 trucks and 6 workers. The foreman walked over holding the approved permit. You sure you want the full perimeter? I looked across the playground where dew still clung to the swings. It was strangely peaceful without anyone there. Yes, I answered. Let's do it. They worked with incredible efficiency. Steel posts went into the ground first, then heavy chain link sections, then locking gates at both entrances. I had 12 bright signs installed every few yards that simply read, "Private property, no trespassing." Nothing dramatic, no insults, no threats, just facts. Around noon, Melissa finally showed up in a white SUV, slamming the driver's door so hard I thought the window might crack. She marched across the grass waving her phone. You can't do this. I looked at the survey stake beside us. Actually, I can. Children play here, on my land. You're punishing families. No, I'm protecting myself because you refused every opportunity to solve this. She stepped closer until we were barely 6 feet apart. Do you have any idea how this is going to look? I held her gaze. I've spent the last month worrying about what was right. You spent the last month worrying about what it would look like. She opened her mouth, then stopped. For just a second, I thought maybe she'd finally apologize. Instead, she turned around, got back into her SUV, and sped away. The fence was finished before 2 in the afternoon. Sunday passed quietly. A few curious neighbors walked by. Some shook their heads. Others stared at the signs before pulling out their phones, probably looking up county property maps for themselves. Then Monday arrived. I was drinking coffee on my front porch just after 3 in the afternoon when I heard the first confused voices. School had just let out. Children came running toward the playground exactly as they had every weekday for months. Only this time, they stopped at a locked gate. One little boy tugged on the chain link fence and asked his mother, why won't it open? She didn't know. Within minutes, dozens of parents surrounded the entrance. Some looked angry. Others looked genuinely confused. Several started calling board members. Then my phone rang. Melissa's name flashed across the screen again. I already knew before answering that the conversation we'd avoided for nearly a month was finally about to explode into something the entire neighborhood would remember for years. Melissa didn't even say hello. The second I answered, she exploded. What is wrong with you? There are children crying because of you. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, took a sip of coffee, then said as calmly as I could, no, Melissa. They're crying because your board built a playground on land that never belonged to the HOA. She laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. You think repeating that makes it true? County records make it true. You're destroying this neighborhood over a piece of grass. It stopped being a piece of grass the day your contractors poured concrete without permission. She hung up before I finished the sentence. 10 minutes later, my driveway looked like a town hall meeting. Parents, board members, curious neighbors. Everyone suddenly wanted to talk. Some people shouted before they even got out of their cars. One father pointed toward the fenced playground and yelled, "You couldn't wait until summer?" Another woman shook her head and said, "I hope you're proud of yourself." I listened without interrupting because I understood what they were seeing. They weren't seeing months of ignored emails or certified letters or legal reports. They were seeing disappointed children standing outside a locked gate. Then something unexpected happened. An older couple walked quietly through the crowd carrying a folder. The husband introduced himself as Richard. I worked 30 years as a civil engineer, he said. I pulled the county GIS maps this morning. He held up several printed pages. He's right. The crowd became strangely quiet. Richard continued. Not mostly right. Completely right. The entire playground sits inside Mr. Brooks' parcel. Another neighbor stepped forward. Wait, are you saying the board never checked? Richard shrugged. Apparently not. You could actually feel the mood beginning to shift. Question for placed accusations. People stopped looking at me and started looking toward the clubhouse where several HOA board members had gathered. By Wednesday evening, the regular HOA meeting was standing room only. I'd never attended one before, but this time I figured I should hear what everyone had to say. Melissa opened the meeting by calling my actions an attack on community values. Then David, my attorney, stood up and quietly placed 4 folders on the board's table. One contained the survey. Another held the title Insurance Report. The third contained every unanswered email and certified letter. The last one contained photographs showing the empty lot before construction even began. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, one board member looked directly at Melissa and asked, "Did you receive these emails?" She hesitated just long enough for everyone in the room to notice. "Yes." "Why didn't we discuss them? I believe the ownership claim wasn't valid." David spoke before anyone else could. Based on what evidence? She didn't answer because there wasn't one. That silence did more damage than any argument I could have made. Within 48 hours, nearly 50 homeowners had signed a petition demanding an independent review of every major project approved during Melissa's presidency. The neighborhood Facebook page, which had spent 2 days calling me greedy, suddenly filled with screenshots of county records and questions about where the fundraising money had gone. Then came the lawyer. A letter arrived from an attorney representing the HOA demanding I remove the fence immediately. David read it once, smiled, and mailed back a package thicker than the original demand. Survey, plat map, title documents, insurance findings, certified mail receipts, time-stamped photographs. We heard absolutely nothing for almost 2 weeks. That's when Melissa knocked on my front door herself. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhausted that comes from too many sleepless nights rather than too many hours worked. She carried a cashier's check and placed it on my kitchen table. $48,000, she said. The board voted to purchase the land. I looked at the check for maybe 3 seconds before sliding it back toward her. No, she blinked. No, I'm not selling. Name your price. It's not about the price anymore. Her shoulders slumped. Then what do you want? I already knew the answer because David and I had spent days discussing it. The playground stays exactly where it is. The children don't lose it, but the HOA leases the property. She frowned. Leases? $1,200 a month, 20 years. Every payment due on the 1st. That's outrageous. Not really. It's cheaper than tearing everything out and rebuilding somewhere else. She stayed silent, so I continued. The agreement gets recorded with the county. The HOA maintains every piece of equipment, carries full insurance, installs security cameras, pays my legal fees, and if payments are ever missed beyond the grace period, I lock the gate until the account is current. He stared at me for several seconds before asking the question I'd been expecting all along. You planned this? I shook my head. No, Melissa. I planned to have an empty field. You planned everything else. The board argued for nearly 6 hours the following week. In the end, the vote wasn't even close. 6 members approved the lease. Only Melissa voted against it. She resigned less than a month later. The first payment arrived 3 days early. So did the second. Then the third. Every month since then, that deposit quietly appears in my account without drama, without lawsuits, and without another argument. Sometimes in the evenings I'll walk past the playground on my way home. The kids still laugh on the swings. Parents still sit under the pavilion. Birthday parties still happen there. The only difference is that now everyone knows exactly whose land they're standing on. And more importantly, everyone understands that good intentions don't erase property rights. Looking back, I don't feel like I won and the neighborhood lost. I think the neighborhood finally learned something valuable. Communities only work when the rules apply equally to everyone, including the people who write them. Empty land isn't abandoned land. Quiet owners aren't weak owners, and assuming you can take something simply because nobody is watching, well, that assumption ended up costing far more than a simple phone call ever would have. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have sold the land, accepted the lease, or demanded the playground be removed entirely? And if you were one of those parents standing outside that locked gate on the first day, Who would you have blamed before you knew the whole story? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever had to deal with an HOA that believed it had more authority than it actually did.